Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a farm in Dearborn Township, Michigan, roughly 8 miles west of Detroit. He was the eldest surviving son of William Ford, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in America during the Great Famine of the 1840s, and Mary Lydigot Ford, herself the daughter of Belgian immigrants. The Ford family were farmers, respectable but not wealthy, working land that William had cleared and cultivated through decades of physical labor. Henry grew up in a world of horses, plows, crop cycles, and the rhythms of agricultural life that had changed little in centuries. He was not born into money. He was not born into industry. He was not born into any particular advantage that would explain what came later. He was simply a farm boy in post-Civil War Michigan, one of millions of similar young men scattered across the American Midwest in an era when most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. From an early age, Henry Ford displayed a fascination with machines that set him apart from his siblings and peers. He disassembled watches to understand their mechanisms. He repaired tools and equipment around the farm with an intuitive grasp of how mechanical parts fit together. His mother recognized this aptitude and encouraged it, but she died in 1876 when Henry was 12 years old, a loss that he would describe for the rest of his life as one of the defining events of his childhood. His father expected him to take over the farm eventually, to continue the family tradition of working the land, but Henry had no interest in agriculture. The repetitive, seasonal nature of farm work held no appeal for him. What captured his imagination were engines, gears, and the possibility of machines that could replace human and animal labor. In 1879, at the age of 16, Henry Ford left the family farm and walked to Detroit to find work as an apprentice machinist. Detroit in this period was a growing industrial city, though not yet the automotive capital it would later become. It was a center for stove manufacturing, shipbuilding, and various metalworking trades. Ford found employment at the Michigan Car Company, which built railroad cars, and later at the Flower Brothers Machine Shop and the Detroit Dry Dock Company. These apprenticeships were informal by later standards, but they provided Ford with hands-on training in metalworking, engine repair, and the practical engineering skills that formal education might have given him through theory, but could not have given him through experience. He learned to work with steam engines, the dominant power technology of the era, and he began to understand the principles that made machines move. During these years, Ford also encountered the internal combustion engine for the first time. This technology was still in its infancy. The German engineers Nikolaus Otto and Carl Benz were developing practical gasoline engines in Europe, but in America, the technology was virtually unknown outside of specialized engineering circles. Ford read about these developments in technical journals and recognized immediately that the internal combustion engine represented something fundamentally different from steam power. Steam engines were large, heavy, and required constant attention to maintain pressure. They were suitable for factories and locomotives, but impractical for smaller, more mobile applications. The internal combustion engine, by contrast, was compact, relatively lightweight, and could be started and stopped quickly. Ford saw in this technology the potential for a self-propelled vehicle that ordinary people could operate without specialized training. In 1888, Ford married Clara Bryant, a farmer's daughter he had met at a New Year's Eve dance several years earlier. Clara would remain his wife for the rest of his life and would prove to be one of his most consistent supporters during the difficult years ahead. The couple settled initially on a 40-acre plot of land that William Ford gave them, and Henry attempted briefly to make a living through farming and lumber. But his heart was never in agriculture. He continued to tinker with engines and machinery in his spare time, and in 1891, he accepted a position as an engineer with the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. This job provided him with a steady income and, more importantly, access to electrical and mechanical equipment that he could study and experiment with. He rose through the ranks quickly, becoming chief engineer by 1893, a position that gave him both financial security and the freedom to pursue his private obsession with building a gasoline-powered vehicle. The early 1890s were a period of intense experimentation in what would later be called the automobile industry, though that term did not yet exist in any meaningful sense. In Europe, Carl Benz had produced what is generally recognized as the first true automobile in 1885, and by the early 1890s, a small number of European manufacturers were producing vehicles for wealthy customers. In America, development was more scattered. Various inventors and tinkerers were working on self-propelled vehicles, but there was no established industry, no standard design, and no clear sense of whether such vehicles would ever be more than expensive curiosities for the rich. The dominant modes of transportation remained the horse, the railroad, and the bicycle, which was enjoying a tremendous boom in popularity during this period. Ford worked on his vehicle in a small brick shed behind his home on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, spending his evenings and weekends assembling components, testing designs, and solving the countless engineering problems that arose. He built his own engine, a simple two-cylinder design that produced about 4 horsepower. He constructed a frame from iron pipes. He mounted 4 bicycle wheels for mobility and created a simple steering mechanism using a tiller rather than a wheel. He called his creation the Quadricycle, a name that reflected its debt to bicycle technology. By the spring of 1896, the vehicle was nearly complete, but Ford discovered that he had made a critical error. The shed door was too narrow for the quadricycle to pass through. He had been so focused on building the machine that he had failed to consider how he would get it out of the building. He solved the problem by taking an axe to the brick wall, widening the doorway enough to push the vehicle out into the alley. On June 4, 1896, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Henry Ford drove the quadricycle through the streets of Detroit for the first time. The vehicle was crude by any standard. It had no reverse gear, no brakes to speak of, and could reach a maximum speed of about 20 miles per hour. But it worked. It moved under its own power through the darkened streets, with Ford at the tiller and a friend riding ahead on a bicycle to warn any late-night pedestrians or horse-drawn vehicles of the strange machine approaching. This midnight test drive was not the birth of the automobile, which had already been invented elsewhere, but was the beginning of Henry Ford's career as an automobile manufacturer and, in a broader sense, the beginning of Detroit's transformation into the center of the American automotive industry. Ford was 32 years old when he completed the quadricycle, which made him a relatively late entrant into a field where many pioneers had started younger. But his timing, in retrospect, proved advantageous. The automobile industry in 1896 was still undefined, without established practices, dominant designs, or clear market leaders. Everything remained to be determined. Ford spent the next several years refining his designs, building additional vehicles, and attempting to attract investors who might help him manufacture automobiles on a commercial scale. He sold the original quadricycle for $200 and used the money to begin work on an improved model. He attracted the attention of several Detroit businessmen who saw potential in the automobile business, and in 1899, he helped found the Detroit Automobile Company with their financial backing. The Detroit Automobile Company represented Ford's first attempt at commercial automobile manufacturing, and it failed almost immediately. The company produced only about 20 vehicles before shutting down in 1901, unable to manufacture cars quickly enough or cheaply enough to generate a profit. The investors blamed Ford, who they felt was more interested in perfecting his designs than in producing vehicles for sale. Ford blamed the investors, who he felt were more interested in quick profits than in building a quality product. The truth probably lay somewhere in between. Ford was not yet the manufacturing genius he would later become, and his perfectionist tendencies made him difficult to work with in a commercial context. But he learned from this failure. He learned that building a successful automobile company required more than engineering skill. It required a clear strategy, efficient production methods, and a product that customers actually wanted to buy. After the collapse of the Detroit Automobile Company, Ford turned briefly to racing as a way to attract attention and investors for his next venture. Racing was the primary means by which early automobile manufacturers demonstrated the reliability and performance of their vehicles, and a victory in a well-publicized race could generate enormous publicity. In October 1901, Ford entered a race at the Grosse Pointe track near Detroit, driving a vehicle he had built himself against Alexander Winton, one of the most successful American automobile manufacturers of the era. Winton was the heavy favorite, but his car developed mechanical problems during the race, and Ford won by a significant margin. The victory made headlines across the country and established Ford as a legitimate figure in the emerging automobile industry. More importantly, it attracted the attention of investors who were willing to provide capital for a new manufacturing venture. The racing victory at Grosse Pointe brought Ford the attention he needed, and in late 1901, he formed the Henry Ford Company with backing from several Detroit investors, including William Murphy and Lemuel Bowen, who had been involved in the earlier Detroit Automobile Company. But this second venture collapsed even more quickly than the first. Ford's backers brought in Henry Leland, an experienced machinist and engineer, to oversee production and keep the company on a practical commercial footing. Ford and Leland clashed almost immediately over the direction of the company. Leland wanted to produce a conventional automobile for the existing market of wealthy buyers. Ford wanted to continue developing and refining his designs, pursuing a vision of a vehicle that was still taking shape in his mind. Within months, Ford left the company, taking a small cash settlement and the rights to use his own name. The Henry Ford Company reorganized under new leadership and eventually became the Cadillac Automobile Company, which would go on to considerable success producing luxury vehicles. Ford, meanwhile, found himself starting over again at the age of 39, with two failed companies behind him and no clear path forward. What saved Ford's career in this period was his continued involvement in racing. He built two massive racing cars, nicknamed 999 and the Arrow, with the help of a bicycle racer named Tom Cooper. These vehicles were designed purely for speed, with minimal concern for comfort, safety, or practicality. They were powered by enormous four-cylinder engines that produced far more horsepower than any production automobile of the era. Ford himself found the cars too dangerous to race competitively, but he hired a professional cyclist named Barney Oldfield to drive 999 in a race at Grosse Pointe in October 1902. Oldfield had never driven an automobile before, but he learned quickly and won the race decisively, setting a new American speed record in the process. The publicity from this victory, combined with the earlier success in 1901, established Ford as one of the leading names in American automobile development, even though he had yet to successfully manufacture and sell vehicles on a commercial scale. In June 1903, Henry Ford made his third attempt at building an automobile company, and this time he succeeded. The Ford Motor Company was incorporated on June 16, 1903, with 12 investors contributing a total of $28,000 in cash. Ford himself contributed no cash but received a 25% stake in the company in exchange for his designs, his expertise, and his name. The largest investor was Alexander Malcolmson, a Detroit coal dealer, who provided most of the initial capital and played a significant role in the company's early management. Other investors included John and Horace Dodge, who owned a machine shop that would manufacture engines and other components for Ford vehicles, and James Couzens, a bookkeeper who worked for Malcolmson and who would become one of the most important figures in the company's early success. The Ford Motor Company began operations in a small converted wagon factory on Mack Avenue in Detroit. The company did not actually manufacture automobiles in the modern sense of the word. Instead, it assembled vehicles from components produced by outside suppliers. The Dodge brothers provided engines, transmissions, and axles. Other suppliers provided wheels, bodies, and various smaller parts. Ford employees assembled these components into finished vehicles, tested them, and shipped them to customers. This assembly model was common in the early automobile industry, when most manufacturers lacked the capital and facilities to produce all components in-house. It allowed Ford to start production quickly with minimal investment in machinery and tooling, though it also meant that the company was heavily dependent on its suppliers and had limited control over quality and costs. The first Ford automobile produced by the new company was the Model A, a small, relatively simple vehicle powered by a two-cylinder engine that produced about 8 horsepower. The car sold for $850, which positioned it in the middle of the market, below the luxury vehicles produced by companies like Packard and Pierce Arrow, but above the cheapest vehicles then available. The Model A was not a revolutionary design, but it was reliable, relatively easy to operate, and backed by Ford's growing reputation as an engineer and racing champion. The company sold over 1,700 vehicles in its first 15 months of operation and generated enough profit to pay dividends to its investors. For the first time in his career, Henry Ford was running a successful automobile business. The early years of the Ford Motor Company were marked by rapid growth and continuous experimentation with new models. Between 1903 and 1908, the company produced a succession of vehicles designated by letters of the alphabet, each representing an attempt to find the optimal combination of features, performance, and price. The Model C was an improved version of the Model A. The Model B was a larger, more expensive vehicle aimed at the luxury market. The Model N, introduced in 1906, was a small, inexpensive car that sold for around $500 and proved enormously popular. Each model taught Ford and his team something new about what customers wanted and what manufacturing methods worked best. The company moved from the small Mack Avenue plant to a larger facility on Paquette Avenue, and employment grew from a handful of workers to several hundred. During this period, Ford also consolidated his control over the company. Alexander Malcolmson, who had provided much of the initial capital, favored producing expensive luxury vehicles that would generate higher profit margins per unit. Ford believed the future lay in producing inexpensive vehicles that ordinary people could afford. This disagreement led to an extended power struggle that ended in 1906 when Malcolmson sold his shares and left the company. Ford acquired a controlling interest by purchasing shares from several departing investors, and by 1907, he owned 58% of the Ford Motor Company. James Couzens, who had sided with Ford against Malcolmson, became the company's business manager and handled most of the financial and administrative work, leaving Ford free to focus on engineering and manufacturing. The success of the Model N convinced Ford that the market for inexpensive automobiles was far larger than most industry observers believed. In 1906 and 1907, the typical automobile buyer was wealthy, often a professional or businessman who could afford to spend several $1,000s on a vehicle and hire a driver or mechanic to maintain it. The automobile was a luxury item, a status symbol, a plaything for the rich. But Ford saw something different. He saw farmers who could use a reliable vehicle to transport crops and supplies. He saw salesmen who could cover their territories more efficiently. He saw doctors who could reach patients more quickly. He saw ordinary families who might use an automobile for recreation and transportation if only they could afford one. The automobile, in Ford's vision, was not inherently a luxury. It was simply a machine, and like all machines, it could be made cheaper and more accessible through improved manufacturing methods. This vision crystallized in the Model T, which Ford and his engineering team began developing in late 1906 and early 1907. The Model T was designed from the beginning to be different from any automobile that had come before. It was not designed to be the fastest, the most luxurious, or the most technologically advanced vehicle on the market. It was designed to be useful. It was designed to be affordable. It was designed to be durable. It was designed for the roads that actually existed in America, which in this period were largely unpaved, rutted, muddy, and primitive by European standards. The Model T had a high ground clearance to handle rough terrain. It had a simple, robust engine that could be repaired by farmers and small-town mechanics with basic tools. It had a planetary transmission that was easier to operate than the sliding gear transmissions used by most competitors. Every design decision reflected Ford's understanding of who would buy the car and how they would use it. The Model T was introduced on October 1, 1908, at a price of $850 for the most basic version. This was not the cheapest automobile on the market, but it offered far more value than competitors at similar prices. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Orders poured in faster than the company could fill them. Within months, it became clear that the Model T was not simply another successful model in a succession of successful models. It was something fundamentally different, a vehicle that appealed to a market segment that had barely existed before. Ford had not simply built a better car. He had identified and begun to create a new kind of customer, the middle-class American who had never considered automobile ownership possible and who now discovered that it might be within reach. The challenge that faced Ford in 1909 and 1910 was not generating demand. Demand was effectively unlimited. The challenge was meeting that demand efficiently enough to keep prices low while still generating profits. The Piquette Avenue plant, which had seemed enormous when Ford moved there in 1904, was now completely inadequate. Production methods that had worked for hundreds of vehicles per year could not scale to thousands or tens of thousands. Ford needed a new factory, new machinery, new methods, and new ways of thinking about manufacturing itself. The answer he found would transform not just the automobile industry, but the entire structure of industrial production in the 20th century. In 1910, the Ford Motor Company moved its operations to a new factory in Highland Park, a small municipality surrounded by the city of Detroit. The Highland Park plant was unlike any automobile factory that had existed before. It was designed from the ground up for a single purpose, the mass production of the Model T, and every element of its layout reflected the lessons Ford and his team had learned over the previous 7 years. The building itself was revolutionary in its construction. Designed by the architect Albert Kahn, it used reinforced concrete and enormous glass windows that flooded the interior with natural light, earning it the nickname the Crystal Palace. The plant covered more than 60 acres and provided over 50,000 square feet of floor space on multiple levels. It was, at the time of its completion, one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world. But the physical building was only the beginning. What made Highland Park transformative was what happened inside it. Ford and his production managers, particularly Charles Sorensen and Clarence Avery, began systematically analyzing every step of the manufacturing process, looking for ways to reduce wasted time and motion. They studied how workers moved through the factory. They timed how long each operation took. They experimented with different arrangements of tools, parts, and workstations. The goal was to eliminate every unnecessary movement, every moment of delay, every inefficiency that added cost without adding value. This was not entirely new thinking. The principles of scientific management had been articulated by Frederick Winslow Taylor and others in the preceding decades, and various industries had experimented with more systematic approaches to production. But no one had ever applied these principles as comprehensively or as successfully as Ford would at Highland Park. The key breakthrough came in 1913 with the introduction of the moving assembly line. The concept was simple in principle. Instead of having workers move from one stationary vehicle to another, performing different operations at each stop, the vehicles themselves would move along a conveyor system while workers remained in fixed positions, performing the same operation repeatedly as each vehicle passed. This arrangement had several immediate advantages. Workers did not waste time walking from place to place. They did not waste time searching for tools or parts, which were positioned within easy reach. They became extremely proficient at their specific tasks through constant repetition. And the pace of work was determined by the speed of the line itself, rather than by individual workers, which meant that production could be standardized and predicted with unprecedented accuracy. The first moving assembly line at Highland Park was installed in the magneto department in April 1913. A magneto was a component of the ignition system, and its assembly had previously required about 20 minutes of skilled labor per unit. Under the new system, the assembly process was broken into 29 separate operations, each performed by a different worker as the magneto moved along a conveyor belt. The time required dropped to 13 minutes almost immediately, and with further refinements, it fell to 5 minutes. This represented a productivity increase of roughly 400%. Ford and his managers quickly applied the same principles to other components, including engines, transmissions, and axles. By the end of 1913, the assembly line concept had spread throughout the factory. In January 1914, Ford installed the final piece, a moving line for the chassis assembly itself, which brought together all the component sub-assemblies into a finished automobile. The results were astonishing by any measure. In 1912, before the full implementation of assembly line production, it took approximately 12 and a half hours of labor to assemble a Model T chassis. By 1914, that time had fallen to 93 minutes. The factory that had produced just over 10,000 vehicles in 1909 produced more than 300,000 in 1914. And as production increased, costs fell. Ford passed these savings on to customers through a series of price reductions that made the Model T progressively more affordable. The base price, which had been $850 in 1908, fell to $550 in 1913 and to $440 in 1915. By 1925, a new Model T could be purchased for less than $300. No other manufacturer could match these prices, and Ford's market share grew accordingly. By 1914, the Ford Motor Company was producing nearly half of all automobiles sold in the United States. The assembly line transformed the nature of industrial work itself. The craftsmen and skilled mechanics who had dominated automobile manufacturing in its early years were largely replaced by unskilled or semi-skilled workers who performed simple, repetitive tasks. A worker on the Ford assembly line did not need to understand how an automobile worked. He did not need years of training or apprenticeship. He needed only to perform his specific operation correctly thousands of times per day, at the pace set by the moving line. This was, in many ways, dehumanizing work. Workers complained of boredom, fatigue, and the relentless pressure of the line, which never stopped and never slowed down. The work was physically demanding and mentally numbing. Turnover at Highland Park was extraordinarily high. In 1913, the company had to hire more than 50,000 workers to maintain a workforce of about 14,000, meaning that the average worker stayed less than 4 months. Ford addressed this problem in January 1914 with an announcement that shocked the industrial world. He declared that the Ford Motor Company would henceforth pay its workers a minimum of $5 per day, more than double the prevailing wage for factory work. This was not philanthropy. Ford was explicit that his motivations were practical rather than charitable. High turnover was expensive. Training new workers took time and reduced productivity. Workers who were paid well will be more loyal, more productive, and more likely to stay with a company. But the $5 day also reflected Ford's broader vision of what mass production could accomplish. If workers were paid enough to afford the products they made, they would become customers as well as employees. Mass production required mass consumption, and mass consumption required that ordinary workers have enough money to buy more than just the necessities of survival. The $5 day was both a wage policy and an economic philosophy. The announcement generated enormous publicity, almost all of it positive. Newspapers across the country praised Ford as an enlightened employer who was pointing the way toward a new relationship between capital and labor. Thousands of workers descended on Highland Park seeking employment, and the company was able to hire selectively, choosing the best candidates from an enormous pool of applicants. Turnover dropped dramatically. Productivity increased as workers became more experienced and more committed to their jobs. The wage increase paid for itself within months through reduced training costs and improved efficiency. Other manufacturers were forced to raise their own wages to compete for workers, spreading the benefits throughout the Detroit labor market. Ford had demonstrated that high wages and high profits were not incompatible, and that treating workers as potential consumers could be good for business as well as good for society. But the $5 day came with conditions that revealed a darker side of Ford's vision. To qualify for the full wage, workers had to meet standards of personal conduct that Ford and his managers consider appropriate. The company established a sociological department, staffed by investigators who visited workers' homes to ensure that they were living according to Ford's principles. Workers had to be thrifty, sober, and clean. They had to avoid gambling and excessive drinking. They had to maintain stable family lives. Immigrant workers were required to attend English language classes and Americanization programs. Those who failed to meet these standards received only the base wage of about $2.30 per day. The sociological department represented Ford's belief that he had both the right and the responsibility to shape the lives of his workers, a paternalistic approach that mixed genuine concern for worker welfare with an intrusive and controlling surveillance apparatus. By 1915, the Ford Motor Company had become the dominant force in the American automobile industry and one of the largest and most profitable corporations in the world. The Highland Park plant was producing more than 500,000 vehicles per year, and the Model T had become synonymous with the automobile itself. Ford had achieved something remarkable, the creation of an entirely new market for a product that had not existed 20 years earlier. He had democratized personal transportation, making it accessible to farmers, workers, and families who could never have afforded the luxury vehicles of the early automobile era. And he had done so through innovations in manufacturing that will be studied and imitated for decades to come. The assembly line, the $5 day, the systematic elimination of waste, these were not merely business strategies. They were the foundations of what contemporaries were already beginning to call Fordism, a comprehensive approach to industrial production that would shape the 20th century. The success of the Model T and the Highland Park system generated profits on a scale that few businesses had ever achieved. By 1916, the Ford Motor Company was earning more than $50 million per year in net profit, and Henry Ford personally had become one of the wealthiest men in America. But this success also created tensions within the company's ownership structure. Ford held a controlling majority of the shares, but significant minority stakes remained in the hands of the original investors and their heirs, most notably the Dodge brothers John and Horace, who together owned about 10% of the company. The Dodge brothers had been essential partners in Ford's early years, manufacturing engines and other components at their machine shop before Ford developed the capacity to produce these parts in-house. But by 1913, the relationship had soured. The Dodge brothers wanted to start their own automobile company and needed capital to do so. They also believed they were entitled to larger dividend payments from Ford's enormous profits. Ford had different ideas about what to do with the company's earnings. Rather than distributing profits to shareholders, he wanted to reinvest them in expanded production capacity, lower prices, and higher wages. In 1916, he announced plans to build an entirely new manufacturing complex on the River Rouge, a tributary of the Detroit River about 10 miles southwest of Highland Park. This facility would be far larger than Highland Park, designed not merely to assemble automobiles but to manufacture virtually every component from raw materials. Ford envisioned a vertically integrated operation where iron ore and coal would enter at one end and finished automobiles would emerge at the other. The Rouge, as it came to be known, represented Ford's ambition to control every aspect of automobile production, eliminating dependence on outside suppliers and capturing the profits that had previously gone to component manufacturers. The Dodge brothers saw Ford's expansion plans as a threat to their dividend income and filed a lawsuit in 1916 seeking to compel Ford to distribute a larger share of profits to shareholders. The case went to trial in 1917 and produced testimony that revealed Ford's thinking about the purpose of business enterprise. When asked why he did not pay higher dividends, Ford responded that his ambition was to employ more people and to spread the benefits of industrial production as widely as possible, rather than to maximize returns to shareholders. The business, he suggested, existed to serve purposes beyond mere profit. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the Dodge brothers on narrow legal grounds, ordering Ford to pay a special dividend of about $19 million. But Ford had no intention of sharing control with minority shareholders who did not share his vision. He began quietly buying up Ford Motor Company stock from anyone willing to sell, and in 1919, he announced that he was leaving the company to start a new automobile business with his son Edsel. This announcement, whether genuine or strategic, drove down the price of Ford shares and persuaded the remaining minority shareholders to sell. By July 1919, Henry Ford and his family owned 100% of the Ford Motor Company, having paid approximately $106 million to buy out all outside investors. The River Rouge plant that Ford had envisioned began operations in 1917 and expanded continuously over the following decade until it became the largest integrated manufacturing facility in the world. At its peak, the Rouge employed more than 100,000 workers and covered more than 2,000 acres. It included its own steel mill, glass factory, rubber processing plant, and power generation station. Ford acquired iron mines in Michigan and Minnesota, coal mines in Kentucky and West Virginia, forests in the Upper Peninsula for lumber, and a rubber plantation in Brazil. He purchased a railroad to transport materials and a fleet of ships to carry iron ore across the Great Lakes. The goal was complete self-sufficiency, the elimination of every middleman and every external dependency that added cost or complexity to production. No industrialist before Ford had attempted vertical integration on this scale, and few would attempt it afterward. The Rouge represented the fullest expression of Ford's manufacturing philosophy, but it also revealed the limitations of his approach. The system worked brilliantly for producing a single standardized product in enormous quantities. The Model T remained essentially unchanged throughout the 1910s and into the 1920s, receiving only minor modifications while competitors introduced new models and features. Ford famously resisted any change to the basic design, reportedly telling customers that they could have any color they wanted as long as it was black. This standardization was not arbitrary. It reflected the requirements of mass production as Ford understood it. Every change to the product required changes to tooling, processes, and training. Variation meant complexity, and complexity meant cost. The assembly line achieved its efficiency precisely because it produced identical units in endless repetition. To introduce variety was to sacrifice the very advantages that made the Model T affordable. This philosophy served Ford well as long as the Model T remained competitive in the marketplace. Throughout the late 1910s and early 1920s, it continued to dominate American automobile sales, and Ford's market share remained above 50% in most years. But the market was changing in ways that Ford either did not perceive or chose to ignore. As automobile ownership became more widespread, customers began to want more than basic transportation. They wanted comfort, style, and features that distinguished their vehicles from those of their neighbors. They wanted enclosed cabins that protected them from weather. They wanted electric starters that eliminated the dangerous and physically demanding process of hand-cranking the engine. They wanted more powerful engines and smoother rides. The Model T, designed in 1907 for the roads and customers of that era, was increasingly outdated compared to newer vehicles from competitors. The most significant competitive threat came from General Motors, which had been formed in 1908 through the consolidation of several smaller automobile companies, and which had nearly collapsed in 1920 before being reorganized under the leadership of Alfred Sloan. Sloan's approach to the automobile business was fundamentally different from Ford's. Where Ford believed in a single product for a mass market, Sloan believed in market segmentation, offering a range of vehicles at different price points to appeal to different customers. General Motors produced Chevrolets for budget-conscious buyers, Pontiacs and Oldsmobiles for the middle market, Buicks for the upper middle market, and Cadillacs for the wealthy. Customers could move up through the GM product line as their incomes increased, remaining loyal to the company throughout their lives. Sloan also introduced the annual model change, redesigning vehicles each year with new features and styling to encourage customers to replace their cars more frequently. This approach created demand through planned obsolescence, making last year's models seem dated and undesirable. By the mid-1920s, the limitations of Ford's single-product strategy were becoming increasingly apparent. Model T sales remained strong in absolute terms, but market share was declining as competitors offered more attractive alternatives. Chevrolet, in particular, was gaining ground rapidly, offering a more modern vehicle at a price only slightly higher than the Model T. Ford responded by cutting prices further, reducing the cost of a basic Model T to below $300 by 1925. But price cuts could not compensate indefinitely for an outdated product. Customers who could afford slightly more than the minimum price were choosing Chevrolets and other competitors. Ford was winning the race to the bottom while losing the larger battle for the evolving automobile market. Henry Ford resisted acknowledging this reality for years. He had built his company and his fortune on the Model T, and he had an emotional attachment to the vehicle that went beyond business calculation. He had also built an enormous manufacturing infrastructure optimized specifically for Model T production. The River Rouge plant, the assembly lines, the supplier networks, the tooling and machinery, all of it was designed for one product. Changing to a new model would require scrapping much of this infrastructure and rebuilding from scratch. The cost would be enormous, and the disruption to production would be severe. Ford delayed the decision as long as possible, continuing to insist that the Model T was sufficient for American needs, that customers who wanted luxury and style were being misled by advertising and salesmanship, that the fundamental soundness of his approach would eventually be vindicated. By 1926, the evidence was undeniable. Ford's market share had fallen below 40% and was continuing to decline. Chevrolet sales were approaching Model T sales for the first time. Dealers were complaining that they could not sell Model Ts against more modern competition. Ford's own son Edsel, who had been president of the company since 1919, had been urging his father to develop a new model for years. In May 1927, Henry Ford finally conceded. He announced that production of the Model T would cease, and that a new vehicle, designated the Model A, would replace it. The last Model T rolled off the assembly line on May 26, 1927. Over 19 years, Ford had produced more than 15 million of them, a record that would stand for decades. The Model T had put America on wheels, transformed the landscape, and created the modern automobile industry. But its time had passed. The transition from the Model T to the Model A was the most disruptive event in the history of the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford had delayed the decision so long that when it finally came, there was no new vehicle ready to replace the old one. The company had to design an entirely new automobile from scratch while simultaneously retooling its factories, retraining its workforce, and maintaining some semblance of business continuity. Production of the Model T ended in May 1927, but the new Model A did not reach dealers until December of that year, and full-scale production did not begin until 1928. For approximately 6 months, the largest automobile manufacturer in the world produced almost nothing. The River Rouge plant fell silent. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off. Suppliers who depended on Ford orders faced their own crises. The shutdown cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in lost sales and revealed how vulnerable even the mightiest industrial enterprise could be when it failed to adapt to changing conditions. The Model A that finally emerged was a significant improvement over the Model T in almost every respect. It had a more powerful 4-cylinder engine, a conventional 3-speed sliding gear transmission, 4-wheel brakes, and a modern electrical system. It was available in a range of body styles and colors, acknowledging the customer preferences that Ford had long dismissed as frivolous. The vehicle was well-engineered, competitively priced, and generally well-received by the public. When it finally became available in late 1927 and early 1928, customers flocked to Ford dealerships to see and order the new model. The company received over 700,000 orders before the first vehicles were delivered. Ford briefly regained its position as the leading American automobile manufacturer, outselling Chevrolet in 1929 and 1930. But the Model A's success could not conceal the deeper problems that had developed within the Ford Motor Company. The long shutdown had allowed General Motors and Chrysler, which had emerged as the third major American manufacturer, to capture customers and market share that proved difficult to reclaim. More fundamentally, the company's organizational structure and management practices had not evolved with its size and complexity. Henry Ford still ran the company as a personal enterprise, making major decisions unilaterally and often impulsively, without systematic planning or professional management. He distrusted formal organization, corporate bureaucracy, and the kind of strategic planning that Alfred Sloan had institutionalized at General Motors. He relied instead on a small circle of trusted subordinates who learned to tell him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The most capable of Ford's early executives had long since departed. James Couzens, who had managed the business side of the company during its formative years, had left in 1915 after a dispute with Ford over the company's stance on World War I. The Dodge brothers had sold their shares and started their own successful company. William Knudsen, a brilliant production manager who had overseen much of the expansion at Highland Park in Eau Rouge, had left in 1921 after repeated clashes with Ford and went on to become president of Chevrolet and later General Motors. Those who remained were either loyal subordinates who deferred to Ford on all matters or, in the case of Harry Bennett, men whose primary qualification was their personal devotion to Ford rather than their business or engineering expertise. Harry Bennett was a former Navy boxer who had joined Ford in 1916 and gradually accumulated enormous power within the company. He ran the service department, which was nominally responsible for plant security, but which functioned in practice as Ford's private intelligence and enforcement arm. Bennett cultivated relationships with underworld figures, employed thugs and ex-convicts, and used intimidation and violence to maintain control over the workforce and to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat to his position. Henry Ford trusted Bennett implicitly and relied on him for tasks that ranged from labor relations to personal security to corporate espionage. As Ford aged and his mental acuity declined, Bennett's influence grew. By the late 1930s, he was widely regarded as the second most powerful person in the company, feared by executives and workers alike. The consequences of Ford's management style became painfully evident during the Great Depression. The economic collapse that began in 1929 devastated the automobile industry along with the rest of the American economy. Sales plummeted, factories closed, and hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Ford's response was characteristically erratic. He initially announced that he would maintain wages and employment, declaring that the depression was a temporary setback that would soon pass. But as losses mounted, he reversed course and began laying off workers by the thousands. Wages were cut repeatedly. Working conditions deteriorated. The welfare capitalism that Ford had pioneered with a $5 day gave way to a harsh regime of speed-ups, arbitrary firings, and constant surveillance by Bennett's service department. Workers who complained or who were suspected of union sympathies were beaten and dismissed. The Model A, despite its initial success, proved unable to sustain Ford's competitive position through the Depression years. General Motors had continued to refine its approach to market segmentation and annual model changes, while Ford clung to its tradition of keeping models in production for extended periods with minimal modification. In 1932, Ford introduced the V8 engine, an 8-cylinder power plant that delivered substantially more power than the 4-cylinder Model A at a competitive price. The Ford V8 was a genuine engineering achievement, the first affordable V8 engine ever mass-produced, and it attracted considerable customer interest. But General Motors countered with its own improvements, and Chrysler proved increasingly competitive as well. Ford's market share, which had rebounded to over 40% after the Model A launch, fell below 30% by the mid-1930s and continued to decline. The labor conflicts that erupted throughout American industry during the 1930s hit Ford with particular force. The United Automobile Workers Union, formed in 1935, targeted the major Detroit manufacturers for organizing campaigns. General Motors and Chrysler both recognized the UAW after bitter strikes in 1936 and 1937, but Ford refused to negotiate and used Bennett's service department to suppress union activity through force. The most notorious incident occurred on May 26, 1937, when UAW organizers attempting to distribute leaflets at the River Rouge plant were attacked and beaten by Bennett's men in what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Photographs of the bloodied organizers, including future UAW President Walter Reuther, were published in newspapers across the country and generated enormous public sympathy for the union cause. But Ford continued to resist, using spies, firings, and violence to prevent unionization for another 4 years. Ford's refusal to recognize the UAW was rooted in his conviction that he knew what was best for his workers, and that outside organizations had no legitimate role in the relationship between employer and employee. He viewed unions as foreign influences, controlled by radicals and agitators who wanted to destroy American industry. This belief was connected to a broader pattern of conspiratorial thinking that had become increasingly prominent in Ford's worldview. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Ford promoted anti-Semitic theories through a newspaper he owned called the Dearborn Independent, which published a series of articles attributing various social and economic problems to Jewish conspiracies. These articles were later collected into a book titled The International Jew, which was translated into German and praised by Adolf Hitler. Ford eventually retracted his anti-Semitic statements and closed the Dearborn Independent in 1927 after facing boycotts and a defamation lawsuit, but his reputation was permanently tarnished. The Ford Motor Company finally recognized the UAW in 1941, after the National Labor Relations Board found the company guilty of systematic violations of workers' rights and after a strike shut down the Rouge plant. Henry Ford wanted to fight on, but his wife Clara reportedly threatened to leave him if he did not settle, and Edsel added his own entreaties. Ford capitulated, and the resulting contract was surprisingly generous to the union, perhaps reflecting Ford's all-or-nothing temperament. But the long resistance to unionization had cost the company dearly in terms of public image, worker loyalty, and management attention that might have been devoted to more productive purposes. The entry of the United States into World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed the Ford Motor Company, along with the rest of American industry, into an arsenal of democracy. Automobile production for civilian use was suspended, and the major manufacturers converted their facilities to produce military equipment. Ford's contribution to the war effort was substantial, including trucks, Jeeps, tank engines, and aircraft engines. The most ambitious undertaking was the Willow Run plant, a massive facility constructed specifically to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers using assembly line techniques adapted from automobile production. The plant, located about 30 miles west of Detroit, was over a mile long and employed more than 40,000 workers at its peak. Initial production was slow and plagued by problems, leading critics to mock the facility as Will It Run. But by 1944, Willow Run was producing a completed bomber every hour, a feat of industrial organization that vindicated Ford's methods even as it demonstrated their limitations when applied to complex products. But Henry Ford himself played little role in directing the war effort. He was 80 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and his physical and mental capacities had been declining for years. He had suffered at least one stroke, possibly more, and he exhibited symptoms consistent with what would now be recognized as dementia or Alzheimer's disease. He was forgetful, confused, and increasingly detached from the daily operations of the company he had founded. The burden of management fell on his son Edsel, who had been president since 1919, but who had never been permitted to exercise real authority. Henry Ford had systematically undermined Edsel throughout his tenure, countermanding his decisions, humiliating him in front of subordinates, and allowing Harry Bennett to sabotage his initiatives. Edsel was a capable executive with good judgment and modern ideas about management, but he was never able to implement them against his father's opposition and Bennett's interference. In May 1943, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at the age of 49. The stress of his impossible position, combined with chronic health problems that his father refused to acknowledge, had broken him. Henry Ford resumed the presidency of the company following Edsel's death, but he was clearly unfit to lead. His confusion worsened, and Bennett's power grew unchecked. The company drifted without direction during a critical period of wartime production. Government officials and company executives alike worried that Ford Motor Company might collapse entirely, with catastrophic consequences for the war effort. The situation became so dire that the Roosevelt administration considered intervening directly to protect war production. The Ford family's response came from an unexpected quarter. Edsel's eldest son, Henry Ford II, was serving as an ensign in the Navy when his father died. He applied for a hardship discharge, which the Navy granted after intervention by Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who recognized the national importance of restoring competent leadership to Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford II returned to Dearborn in August 1943 at the age of 25, with no business experience, no technical training, and no clear path to power in a company still controlled by his aging grandfather and dominated by Harry Bennett. He spent the next 2 years learning the business, building alliances with executives who opposed Bennett, and waiting for his opportunity. That opportunity came in September 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. Clara Ford and Edsel's widow Eleanor confronted Henry Ford and demanded that he relinquish control of the company to his grandson. The exact details of this conversation remain unclear, but the result was definitive. On September 21, 1945, Henry Ford resigned as president, and Henry Ford II assumed the position. One of his first acts was to fire Harry Bennett. The two men met in Bennett's office, and when Bennett realized what was happening, he reached for a gun in his desk drawer. Henry Ford II told him that if he pulled the gun, he would be killed before he could use it. Bennett left the office and never returned to Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford spent his final years in retirement at his estate in Dearborn, increasingly frail and disconnected from the world he had helped create. He died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83, when a flood knocked out electrical power to his home and the primitive conditions briefly returned him to the 19th century world of his childhood. Over 50,000 people filed past his coffin as it lay in state at Greenfield Village, the museum complex he had built to preserve the artifacts of pre-industrial America. Newspapers around the world published lengthy obituaries assessing his legacy, which defied simple characterization. He was hailed as a genius, an innovator, and a benefactor of humanity. He was condemned as an anti-Semite, an authoritarian, and an enemy of organized labor. Both assessments contained truth. The Ford Motor Company that Henry Ford II inherited was in desperate condition. Wartime production had masked fundamental problems of organization, management, and product development. The company was losing money at a rate of nearly $10 million per month. Its accounting systems were so primitive that no one knew exactly how much anything cost. Its management ranks had been hollowed out by decades of arbitrary firings and departures. Its product line was outdated, and its manufacturing facilities, though vast, were inefficient by contemporary standards. General Motors had pulled far ahead during the war years, and even Chrysler had surpassed Ford to claim second place in the American market. Henry Ford II undertook a comprehensive reconstruction of the company over the following decade. He recruited a group of former Army Air Forces statistical control officers, later known as the Whiz Kids, who brought modern analytical methods to Ford's management problems. He hired executives from General Motors and other companies to fill critical leadership positions. He invested heavily in new products, new facilities, and new technologies. He established proper financial controls and planning systems. By the mid-1950s, Ford Motor Company had recovered its position as the second largest American automobile manufacturer and was again profitable and competitive. The company went public in 1956, ending family ownership of all shares and raising capital for continued expansion. The industry that Henry Ford had done more than anyone to create continued to transform American life in the decades after his death. Automobile ownership became nearly universal among American families. Suburbs sprawled outward from cities along highways built to accommodate the traffic that Ford's methods had made possible. Shopping centers, drive-in restaurants, and motels reshaped the commercial landscape. The petroleum industry expanded to fuel the nation's vehicles. The automobile became inextricably linked with American identity, with freedom, mobility, and individual autonomy. The assembly line methods that Ford had pioneered spread to other industries and other countries, enabling mass production of consumer goods that raised living standards throughout the industrialized world. Henry Ford was not the inventor of the automobile, nor was he the inventor of the assembly line, nor was he the first to imagine that ordinary people might someday own personal vehicles. His genius lay in synthesis, in combining existing ideas and technologies into a system that worked at unprecedented scale. He understood that manufacturing was not merely a technical problem but an organizational one, that the arrangement of machines and workers mattered as much as the design of the product itself. He understood that prices could be driven down through volume, and that volume could be increased through lower prices, creating a virtuous cycle that expanded markets rather than simply competing for existing demand. He understood, at least for a time, that workers who were paid well would become customers for the products they made. These insights, applied with relentless energy over 4 decades, transformed not just the automobile industry, but the entire structure of industrial capitalism. The world that emerged was in many ways Ford's creation, for better and for worse. The man who had been born on a Michigan farm 8 years before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed had lived to see automobiles become as fundamental to American life as the horses they replaced. That transformation, more than any single product or innovation, was Henry Ford's legacy.